Ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. Thomas Sowell on the phone with us from Stanford, and he's at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's the Rose and Milton Friedman Fellow. You've put out an expanded version of your very, very excellent book, Intellectuals and Society, and we talked some time back about the Intellectuals and Society. What was the expanded part?
I added 4 new chapters on a whole section titled Intellectuals and Race. Mm-hmm. And my assistant urged me to publish that as a separate book, which in retrospect wish I had done. But yet I wanted this book to really cover the major areas of controversy, intellectual and political. And so I put this in the book, and, mm-hmm. and I advanced various theses in these chapters that I've not advanced before and that I haven't seen anywhere else. For example, I have a long discussion of the whole question of disparities between groups. Well, groups have had disparities as long as there have been groups.
That's right. And the disparities, they don't necessarily mean that there's any kind of injustice or discrimination.
And the other thing that's in the first of these chapters on intellectuals and race is about the role of intellectuals in promoting racism. I mean, the intellectuals today are ready to cry racism at the drop of a hat. But if you go back 100 years ago, 1912, for example, you will find that nobody was pushing the idea that some races were capable only of being hewers of wood and drawers of water, like the intellectuals. Mm-hmm. I mean, Keynes helped found the Eugenics Society at Cambridge University.
Mm-hmm. And Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, Woodrow Wilson. Yeah. Oh, my gosh, yes. Mm-hmm. Woodrow Wilson was showing the movie Birth of a Nation, which glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, in the White House to mm-hmm. various leaders that he called in to view it with him.
And Woodrow Wilson and people around that time, they were called progressives, weren't they?
This was one of the hallmarks of progressivism. People don't understand that the progressives were pushing the idea that not only were there inferior races, and they went beyond blacks and Native Americans. They included the Jews. They included the Italians. They included the peoples of Eastern and Southern Europe in general. And it was they who pushed for laws outlawing intermarriage and restrictions on immigration based upon the race of the people coming in and so on. So it's ironic because, of course, by the last decades of the 20th century, the intellectuals were on the other side. Uh-huh. But in both eras, they did not take any criticism seriously. They dismissed all attempts to say that there were other things to consider. Mm-hmm. And so that dogmatism was there in both times, even though they were saying the opposite things in one period. But there were lots of very people who were respectable. Any number of international scholarly organizations. These were not the village idiots. These were not a bunch of ignorant rednecks. These were people with PhDs from the leading universities in the country, and who were professors at the leading universities in the country.
And something interesting that you said in your book, that the term progressives fell out of favor, and the people who were called progressives, who were calling themselves progressives, soon called themselves liberals.
It's just like bankruptcy. That is when you build up a whole record as looking bad, then you simply change your name and escape the record. It was what I believe FDR was the first one to start calling himself liberal. Uh-huh. He'd been part of the progressive Woodrow Wilson administration.
That's right. And then actually liberals a little bit later on started falling out of favor, and now they're back to progressives.
For the same reason. Now that liberals had disgraced themselves, they had produced so many disastrous programs. They now started calling themselves progressives, and they started demonizing anyone who called them liberals, saying we shouldn't have labels. Labels are very wonderful. It's like brand names with commodities. Mm-hmm. You know, those brand names force you to live with the consequences of what you've done in the past.
Yeah, and it turns out that black Americans have suffered the most as a group for some of these half-baked ideas of the progressives.
Oh, absolutely. And I would include in that the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson. When I think about it, that the black family survived through centuries of slavery, generations of Jim Crow, and then began to fall apart under the liberal welfare state.
That's right, and a lot of people don't know the statistics. You've pointed them out, and I've pointed out in my book, Race and Economics, that in the 1880s, that 75% of black kids lived in two-parent families, where it's hard put to find 30% now, and in places like this Herbert Gutman, I believe.
Oh, yes.
And he points out in Harlem in 1925, 85% of black kids lived in two-parent families, and he also said that it was rare, very rare, to see a black single woman, a teenager or younger woman, raising a child by herself.
That's right. At one period, most of the black female-headed households were headed by widows who were older than teenagers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the rather tragic things for young people, whether they're black or white, but particularly for black youngsters, is the teaching of victimhood. And,
oh God, yes.
And that they're victims and they can't do anything about it, no matter how hard they try. And you kind of think back, well, heck, back in the 40s and the 30s. If young blacks were taught that same lesson back then, well, hell, the civil rights movement would have never started.
That's right. And, of course, there were far more restrictions on blacks then than today. But I never had this sense of futility. I remember giving a talk at Marquette University, and some black young man got up in the audience, and he said, I'm about to graduate from Marquette, but what hope is there for me?
Oh,
and I said, twice the hope there was for your parents, and 4 times the hope there was for your grandparents.
Yeah.
But the grievances and navel gazing and all kinds of stuff, unfortunately, although blacks are the biggest victims of this in the United States, the very same thing goes on in England among whites.
Yes.
People who haven't read Theodore Dalrymple's book, Life at the Bottom, you can see, he says, there are teenagers from this housing project near where he works as a doctor that come to see him, and he finds that, they can't multiply 6 times 9.
Yeah, I wrote about this in this week's column, We Don't Want No Education.
Oh, yes, yes. And you realize that this is a race of people that produced Newton and Shakespeare and so forth, and now they're turning out a whole generation that can't do simple arithmetic and have no conception of reading or even spelling.
Uh-huh. And so it's not a racial thing. It's the underclass and what has been done by the education establishment and the welfare state.
Absolutely. And the two things go together. That is, in order to have the welfare state, you have to promote a welfare state ideology that will justify it in a democracy. And so, therefore, you get all these people thinking they can't do anything, and what's the point of learning because the system is against you anyhow? And it's a deadly ideology.
You're absolutely right.